Black is mostly known for its removal, discard, and draw power, allowing it to function as a powerful mid-range color, or its unique effects letting it help out combo decks. Of course, sometimes this doesn't work out. Sometimes the cards are overcosted, sometimes the effects are just bad, but either way, none of these cards have ever been worth playing. Today, we're going to look at some of the biggest misses that black mages have ever had to put up with. And starting us off at number 10, we have Blood Funnel. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the incredibly powerful ability where all of your non-creature spells cost 2 less to cast. Unfortunately, it also counters every non-creature spell you cast unless you sacrifice a creature. Funnel is a theoretically strong card, but in practice, it backfires more often than not. Fundamentally, it's just very difficult to make sure you always have a creature in play whenever you're going to be casting a non-creature spell. Most decks have the ability to interact with your board, so as soon as they see Blood Funnel down, they can just start killing your creatures and turn off all of your non-creature spells. This is the worst case scenario for the card, but often even the average use case isn't worth it. If you use Blood Funnel to make your removal spells cheaper, for example, you're going down a card to your opponent. This is basically true for every spell you cast with Funnel. The only exceptions are draw spells, but ironically, this is where it's the least necessary. Black already has tons of cards like Village Rites and Deadly Dispute that let you sacrifice creatures to draw cards for cheap. If that's what you wanted to do, you could easily do it without Blood Funnel. So the only real use for the card is as part of some sort of combo, and it has few applications in unfair situations. Guile is a 6-mana creature that lets you recast any of your spells that get countered. If you cast a spell with Guile and Blood Funnel out, you'll be able to cast a spell, let it get countered, then recast it. It'll just get recountered again, but with the right combination of cards, this can still be worthwhile. With a card like Gutter Snipe on board, every loop will also deal damage to your opponent. You can also do this loop with a card like Brain Freeze with the Storm ability, which will create copies of the spell every time you cast it, despite it being countered. The only issue with these combos is that they're terrible. They require multiple cards to do, some of which are actively bad, like Blood Funnel, and others are very expensive, like Guile. Not to mention that once you have Blood Funnel out, it becomes very hard to use counter magic to back up your combo. The only place these combos are going to work out is in Commander. Blood Funnel has the most potential of any card on this list, but its downside is so backbreaking that it's impossible to ever use without shooting yourself in the foot. And at number 9, we have Reclusive Wight. This is a 4/4 zombie minion with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black. It is a downside where, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control another non-land permanent, you have to sacrifice the Wight. Before judging this card too harshly, remember that when this card was printed, a 4/4 for 4 was a good stat line as opposed to slightly below average as it is today. Still, while these stats were better back in the day, it didn't make playing Wight worth it. The thing is, you can't really play Wight as the only non-land permanent in your deck. The only decks that play only instants and sorcery cards are usually combo decks, where Wight won't be doing anything. You could play him alongside only removal and hand rip effects, but then your deck would be far too weak to removal. The point is, you're going to need to play some other creatures or something alongside Wight, which means that a lot of the time, you'll have Wight in hand and not be able to cast it, or have it on board and draw a card and not be able to cast that. This alone leaves you in an awkward spot, but it can easily leave you in a terrible position if your opponent has anything approaching a good board. Let's say you have a Wight and your opponent plays a 5/5 creature. You draw a second copy of Wight. Now, if this were literally any other 4/4, you could cast it and be in a fine spot. However, you can't cast your Wight because they'll both run for the hills at the thought of having to share the board with one another. So you just have to pass turn and let your opponent attack and either chump block or let them win the damage race. Creatures that want to be on board alone aren't exactly rare, to be honest. Cards like Demonic Taskmaster also force you to play them as your only creature to make them any good. The difference is that they only care about creatures, so you can play auras or equipment cards like Homicidal Seclusion to make them bigger. However, Wight's social anxiety apparently extends to both inanimate objects and mere concepts, because if there are any of these cards in play, he'll run for the graveyard. You're stuck with just a 4/4 no matter what. The combination of average stats and one of the most crippling downsides you'll see in a Magic card makes Wight a terrible pick for any deck. And at number 8, we have Bog Hoodlums. This is a 4/1 Goblin Warrior with a mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It has the abilities where you can't block, and when it enters the field, you clash with an opponent. This means you both reveal the top card of your libraries and then put them on top or the bottom of your decks. The player who revealed the card that costs more wins the clash. If you do win the clash, Hoodlum gets a +1/+1 counter. In discussions about what the worst cards in the game are, many players will often argue that creatures can't be the worst cards in the game by default, as they always have the upside of attacking and blocking. They can all, with few exceptions, eventually kill your opponent or trade for another creature if need be. Hoodlums is one of the few cards that this does not apply to. Being unable to block makes any creature a lot worse. However, most creatures with this downside usually have something to make up for it. Recursive threats like Bloodsoaked Champion often have this downside, so they can't be used to chump block indefinitely. For example, Hoodlums has this devastating downside for seemingly no reason, as the card's stats are never all that impressive, even if you do win the clash. High mana value, low toughness creatures are always in a really bad spot without a great ability, as they can easily trade down the curve. Hoodlums has this issue even worse, as not being able to block means you can never pair it against your opponent's more expensive threats for a trade. Instead, your opponent gets to choose what blocks it, and if they have the opportunity to trade it for a 2-drop, they're going to. The entire clash mechanic is so minimal that it doesn't really matter. When you lose the clash, the card is even worse, but even if this card was a 5/2 at all times, it would still be a terrible card. The fact that sometimes its stats are garbage instead of just bad only puts it even higher on this list. And at number 7, we have Chimney Imp. This is a 1/2 imp with a mana cost of 4 and 1 black. It has flying and the ability where, when it dies, target opponent puts a card in their hand back on top of their library. Imp is a bit of a meme card in the community thanks to being almost comically bad. Under no circumstances should you be paying 5 mana for a 1/2 creature without a crazy ability. Meanwhile, Chimney Imp's ability is, well, it's technically an upside, it just won't ever really matter. Cards like Chittering Rats can do this when they enter the battlefield on top of having a better stat line for only 3 mana. This made Rats a good card in Pauper, mainly in Devotion to Black where it curved well into Grave Merchant of Asphodel. Chimney Imp is what happens when you take all the upsides away from Chittering Rats. Its stat line is, once again, just abysmal. The flying just isn't enough to make up for only doing 1 damage at combat on a 5-drop. Worse, the ability to force your opponent to top deck a card in their hand again in a death trigger, which basically takes away any use it could have. For one, being 5 mana means that, a lot of the time, your opponent will already be empty-handed when you play this card, so it won't get any value at all. Since it won't proc until Imp dies, this is even more likely to be true. The only time this ability could theoretically be useful is by finding some way to loop it to completely lock your opponent out of the game. If you can bring Imp back and kill it over and over, you can rip all the cards out of your opponent's hand. And if you can use this during their draw step, you can blank their draws as well. Unfortunately, not only would any combo that could do this be impractical, probably involving an Omniscience on field, but you could more easily do it with Rats because Rats is just this card but way better. So Imp is so small it can be easily ignored in the late game, barely trades with anything that costs around the same amount of mana, and its ability is completely useless. All in all, Chimney Imp is nothing more than a joke that hasn't been funny in a long time. And at number 6, we have Withering Hex. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 black. It has Enchant Creature and the ability where, whenever a player cycles a card, you put a plague counter on Hex. The enchanted creature gets -1/-1 for each plague counter on it. Cycling is an ability that lets you pay an amount of mana to discard the card with cycling and then draw a new card. This is one of the most specific removal spells in the game. The card does stone cold nothing the turn you play it. Then you have to spend a ton of mana cycling other cards to slowly shrink the creature and eventually kill it. The thing about cycling is that you usually don't want to be spending your mana on cycling unless you have to. It's mostly a last resort to try and draw some actual action when you're stuck on mana or something. This is all to say that taking your time to cycle cards to build up your Hex is a huge waste of time. Even worse, once you finally cycle enough cards to kill whatever the Hex is on, it'll be put into the graveyard and you'll have to start all over again on the next Hex you draw. The final nail in the coffin is the fact that Black is famous for its creature removal. Why would you ever play Withering Hex over a card like Doomblade? Even besides Black's most efficient removal, cards like Deathwind are a lot easier to take advantage of than Hex's slow buildup of counters. Hex is slow and inefficient, but somehow it's not the worst Black removal spell we'll be seeing today. And at number 5, we have Pretender's Claim. This is an aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It is Enchant Creature and the ability where whenever that creature becomes blocked, you tap all lands the defending player controls. However, a lot of the time, this might as well be a blank piece of cardboard. The unfortunate truth is that tapping your opponent's lands on your turn is just not that good of an ability. The only time this could come up is if your opponent has held up interaction for your turn, such as with a removal spell. The issue is that, if they do have a removal, they can just cast it in response to you attacking anyway. You specifically need to have a card in hand that you want to play while your opponent is tapped out, and have a blocker that they would want to block it with. Practically, this means you'll only want to use it against blue decks to get around counter magic, as it's the only interaction that would be this time sensitive. This would already not be good enough to play, as it's just worse than discard spells like Duress for trying to force through your plays, and it being an aura makes you too weak to removal. But it's even worse because it gives your opponent the choice about if their lands get tapped or not. Your opponent gets to choose if taking the damage or keeping the interaction up is more important, so you'll never really get the opportunity to force your plays through. All of these Punisher effects have this weakness. but at least cards like Vexing Devil and Brobeat make your opponent choose between two very strong effects as opposed to two mediocre options. And at number 4, we have Fatal Mutation. This is another enchantment aura. This one costs 1 black and has enchant creature. It has the ability where, whenever the enchanted creature's turn face up, you destroy it, and it can't be regenerated. Regeneration, for the unaware, is a niche form of creature protection that has since been phased out. Mutation is a combination of the last 2 cards on this list. It's a removal aura like Withering Hex that doesn't do anything when you play it, and a card that gives your opponent the choice over what it actually does, like Claim did. On top of both of those flaws, it only works against the Morph mechanic, a very niche type of card. Even if the card was 1 mana to destroy a face-down creature, it would be too niche to actually play. While there have been formats where cards like Den Protector were very powerful and important cards, these decks still played too many non-morph creatures for the card to be live consistently. Not to mention that both this hypothetical improved version of the card and Mutation as it exists right now can both be blanked by just turning the creature face up in response to them casting the spell. Of course, Mutation gets even worse. Once you do a Mutation on field, your opponent can just not morph their creature. Morphs are still 2/2 while face down on the field. So while they're not getting as much as they might want from the creature, considering that this will still 2-for-1 you, they'll be more than happy to just sit on their 2/2. However, they can still flip it face up if they want to. Most played morph creatures have some trigger when they're flipped face up, like Hidden Dragon Slayer destroying a creature with 4 more power when it's flipped. If they really need to trigger it, they can still flip them for the trigger. Since most of these triggers will still get a card's worth of value, this is still a 2-for-1 as well. Mutation is the worst removal spell in black. It only hits a few creatures and isn't even good against the few valid targets it does have. And at number 3, we have One With Nothing. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 black. It is the effect where you discard your hand. There isn't any sort of hidden tech here or deck that makes One With Nothing way better than it looks at first glance. This card is just bad. Casting One With Nothing will do nothing but lose you the game. Now, I know there are a lot of naysayers right now screaming at the top of their lungs about how One With Nothing was very strong against Allied Mine. This was a standard deck that would try to burn your opponent to death with Ebony Owl Netsuke by forcing your opponent to draw extra cards with cards like Howling Mine. This was a very good deck back in Kamigawa Standard. The same block One With Nothing was printed in, since Allied Mine was dependent on the number of cards in your hand to burn you, and in your hand One With Nothing would stop any of their burn. This meant that One With Nothing was a viable sideboard card against Allied Mine, meaning that one of the worst Magic cards ever printed actually saw competitive play. At least, that's how the story goes. Unfortunately, tales of One With Nothing's competitive success have been greatly exaggerated. First off, Allied Mine wasn't that good. It saw a few top finishes during the standard at Pro Tour Honolulu, but those were the only tops it saw during that standard. One With Nothing was good against exactly one deck in the metagame, and terrible against everything else. Black decks could play it in order to shore up the match, or they could use any other form of disruption. You can imagine what players went for when faced with the decision between playing good cards in the sideboard and playing a gimmick to help against one deck exactly. One With Nothing could have theoretically been good in the matchup, but it wasn't worth playing, which is why black decks in the format didn't sideboard it, at least topping list in it. In a way, One With Nothing is one of the most overrated cards in the game. Not only do a lot of people mistakenly believe that One With Nothing was a big part of Kamigawa Standard, as opposed to a very niche tech that some players used, but people keep falling for it in new metagames. The card has spiked in price a couple of times thanks to cards like Madness Mechanic coming back, which lets you cast spells that you've discarded, as well as cards like Lupine Prototype being printed in the same set. Every time a mechanic interacts with the graveyard or cares about having few to no cards in hand is printed, someone goes, finally One With Nothing is broken. And it never is. It's maybe the best designed bad Magic card, because it keeps looking playable, keeps gaslighting players to find a way to break it, but never actually does anything. One With Nothing mostly just loses you games when you cast it, but having theoretical use cases is still something that the other cards above it don't really have. And at number 2, we have Hint of Insanity. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and 1 black. It is the effect where target player reveals their hand, then discards all non-land cards with the same name as another card in their hand. Though it might as well just say, pay 3 mana, target player, reveal their hand, and stop there. This will basically never actually work. Even in decks where players are maxed on 4 copies of all their cards, it's not that often that you draw more than 1 copy of a card at the same time. The vast majority of the time you cast Hint, it will let you look at your opponent's hand and then simply go to game 2. However, let's imagine that your opponent actually does have 2 copies of the same card in their hand. Congratulations, you just successfully cast Mind Rod, a card that is also too weak to see play anywhere. Even back in the day, you had discard cards like Duress that were consistently powerful that you could use to protect your players or stop your opponent's combos. There was never a time where Hint wasn't completely outclassed as a discard spell. The only application of Hint of Insanity that's useful is against cards like Relentless Rats that allows you to play any number of cards with a certain name in your deck. These decks will likely draw more than just one of their cards in their opening 7, so you can consistently get rid of the rat infestation before it starts. Unfortunately, these decks are all even bigger memes than One With Nothing is. There are very few cards that do so little every time you play them. However, at the very least, Hint of Insanity doesn't lower your chances of winning the game when you cast it, unlike the absolute worst black magic card. And at number 1, we have Oath of Lim-Dul. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black. It is the ability where you can pay 2 black to draw a card, which is very good. Unfortunately, it also has the ability where whenever you're dealt damage, for each life you lose, you have to sacrifice a permanent other than Oath or discard a card. This is pretty emblematic of Black's greatness at any cost motto. The cost here may be a little too high, considering all you're really getting is the ability to pay 2 mana to draw a card. While the ability can take over the game after a long enough amount of time, any damage forcing you to sacrifice permanents or discard cards is completely backbreaking. All it takes is a straight lightning bolt to the face and you're going down 3 cards. You'll have to start giving up the cards you drew off of Oath or sacrificing your blockers to try and stay in the game. This also snowballs against you really quickly. Once you start taking damage, you'll have to pitch your cards and sack your blockers, which will make stopping your opponent's attacks even more difficult. From that position, it will be even easier for them to get their next hit in, and soon you'll be forced to discard your entire hand and sacrifice your lands. You won't even have time to start drawing off of Oath, because you'll be too far behind on board to ever recover. You also can't sacrifice the Oath to itself to save yourself thanks to how its effect is worded. Essentially, as soon as you start taking damage, you start a downward spiral where more and more of your board gets eaten up, and it becomes even more impossible for you to come back. Oath can only be played when you're so in control of the game that you've basically won 3 turns ago. At which point, you don't need the middling card draw that Oath gives you. Oath can technically do something once it's in play, but it's so risky and so easy for your opponent to exploit that it's more of a liability than anything. The best thing to do with Oath is to use a card like Donate to give it to your opponent, which is a pretty good sign that a card's not good, especially because there are better Donate targets anyway. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other worse black cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.